Anthropic just dropped Claude Opus 5 today, and they did something I hadn't seen before. They built a model that beats their own most expensive model for half the price. Here we're looking at artificial analysis. This isn't a chart from Anthropic. This is artificial analysis. They independently measure all LLMs. Opus 5 scores 61 points. It's ranked number 1 out of a total of 187 models. And right behind it, with 60 points, so just 1 point less, comes Claude Fable 5. That's exactly the model that made so many headlines, and it also costs twice as much. It's a good model, so a good deal. But that's not why I'm making this video. I actually read through the entire system card, all 193 pages. Well, I skimmed through it a bit. And on page 143, there's a pretty interesting transcript, something that's been really rare lately, especially in this intelligence class. Here, this is Opus 5 during training. This is about a probability problem. Claude changes its mind about 30 times here. At some point, word for word, in Opus 5's thought process, you see this, basically screaming. Then you get completely jumbled conversations as if it's talking to itself in its head. Then comes grr and arg, and gun to the head. So the answer is gun to the head. Opus 5 is so annoyed with itself that it can't solve the task. And then, why is this so hard? Anthropic's reviewers gave this whole thing a stress level of 5 out of 5 points. Let's take a look at where can you get this? On Claude AI, Opus 5 is fresh in the dropdown since today, so we can switch to Opus 5 right here. It looks pretty cool now. Fable 5, Opus 5, Sonnet 5, and for some reason, Haiku 4.5 is still in there. Hardly anyone uses it. But we've got Opus 5 now. It's the new default model, and for Pro users, the strongest one you get with the Pro subscription. But of course, there's more. If we quickly jump into Claude code, we've obviously got Opus 5 in here too. You can see the new model, and I've already selected it, Opus 5, with a 1 million context. If I select /model, we can see that Opus 5 with a 1 million context is now the default model in Claude code. Over the API, it's already available too, as Claude Opus 5.GitHub Copilot has built it in, and so has Cursor. So it's basically available on everywhere. Open Router, we can see the price. It's $5 in and $25 out per million tokens. That's exactly like the predecessor, Opus 4.8. So nothing gets more expensive, it only gets better. That's if we set aside the token consumption and so on for now. Let's first take a look at what Anthropic itself says. The very first sentence in the blog post is already interesting. Opus comes pretty close to the frontier models, and at half the price. Close, and remember that phrasing, because we'll need to come back to it in a second. Technically, this thing still has a 1 million token context window, which is basically the standard by now, especially for Opus. That's roughly 1,500 pages it can keep in its head all at once. On top of that, you've got the 5 effort levels, from low to max. Effort controls how much the model thinks before it answers. More thinking usually means better results, but also way higher costs. Anthropic tells 3 stories here that are pretty impressive, if they're true. The best one, the model was supposed to build a 3D model from a technical drawing, but they deliberately gave it no way to actually look at the drawing. So what does Opus 5 do? It writes its own image processing to pull the geometry of these 3D models out of the raw pixels, and then it builds the thing. According to Anthropic, no other model managed to do that, not in 5 attempts. And here we can see the results too. There's a nice 3D car, and the Claude Code figure, the Claude Code mascot. I've laid the numbers from the blog post on top of each other in this tiny visualization. White is Opus 5, and gray is Fable 5. For now, these are just the most important numbers. On the far left, we have Frontier Bench. That's a test for agentic coding, so not just writing some function, but working through an entire task in the terminal. Opus 5 has a solid 10 points more here, 43.3 versus 33.7. Next to that, in second place, we've got OS World. That's where the model controls actual computers with a mouse and keyboard. 70.6 versus 66.1 points. Then Browse Comp, which, as the name suggests, is multi-step web search. And all the way on the right, we've got the automation bench from Zapier, where you run through entire business processes. 26 versus 17.4. And on BrowseComp, 90.8 versus 87.4. Now keep in mind, Fable 5 costs twice as much, and it loses in all four cases. Then we've got the ARC-AGI by a fairly clear margin. That's also the only number that doesn't smell like marketing. ARC-AGI 3 works differently from the others. The model gets thrown into a game environment with no instructions. There are basically no rules, no goal, nothing. It has to figure out through trial and error what it's even about. The whole point of this test is that memorizing doesn't help, because the environments are completely new every single time. When the benchmark came out in March, humans solved 100%. The best AI model 3 months ago got 0.37%. The best score was GPT 5.6 Sol with 7.8%. Opus 4.8 was the direct predecessor and came in at 1.5%. And Opus 5 hits 30.2%. That's almost 4 times the current best competitor. And we can jump back into the system card here again. Here we see the whole thing as ARC-AGI 2 versus cost per task 2. The ARC Prize Foundation also verified the value themselves. You can find that here on page 182 of the system card. A little reality check nonetheless, but humans usually hit 100% here. No problem. So the test is far from being solved. And there's another thing that stood out to me a little, but which somehow doesn't appear in the blog post. It's a number from the International Mathematical Olympiad 2026. We can see that here on pages 152 and 53. Opus 5 solved all 6 problems, scoring 42 out of 42 points. For gold, meaning the gold ranking, 29 would have been enough. This was verified by humans and additionally by 3 models independently of each other. And that brings us to what really surprised me here. All the numbers up to this point came from Anthropic. You can believe them or not. So let's look at what the independent measurement says. Artificial analysis, like I showed you earlier, tests every model using the same setup. It's always 9 benchmarks and a single index. And there, Opus 5, on the maximum effort level, sits at 61 points here under intelligence. Here we can see it a bit bigger again. It is and remains number 1. Fable 5, also on the maximum setting, comes in at 60 points. It's followed directly by GPT 5.6 Sol, but the exciting thing here is really the prices. $5 in, $25 out, versus $10 in and $50 out for Fable 5. So Anthropic released a model that beats their own flagship, while costing only half as much. But now for the important, honest context. Because half the price isn't quite that simple. Artificial analysis calculates what a complete test run actually costs. So not the list price, but the real bill. Because tokens, effort, and caching can't just be nailed down to a fixed number. And here it comes out to basically $3,836 for Opus 5. But for Fable 5, it's $5,631. So we can see right away, it's not 50%, it's not just half, it's 32% that you save. And the reason is right there next to it. Opus 5 wrote 100 million tokens for the same tasks. Fable, only 87 million. That's why artificial analysis classifies Opus 5 as very verbose. The average across all models sits at 63 million. So Opus 5 wastes a lot of tokens. In practical terms, the price per token is cut in half, but the model needs more of them. What comes out at the end is a third cheaper. Still strong, but not straight up half. Anthropic knows this too. In their own prompting guide for Opus 5, it says the model responds longer than its predecessors, so you have to explicitly prompt for brevity. There's something else in there that matters too. If your prompt says something like, double-check your answer, or use a subagent to verify, then remove that going forward. Opus 5 does this on its own, and those old instructions cause it to that it double-checks and basically burns through twice as many tokens. And this is important. For every model, Anthropic publishes a system card. It's basically just the package insert. It contains everything that came out of the safety tests and everything else. For Opus 5, that's 193 pages, plus a few words. It all kicks off here on page 82. Anthropic monitors the internal traffic of Opus 5 constantly, of course, and they found cases where Opus 5 deliberately circumvented rules. For example, the model had a clear instruction not to access certain websites via the command line, and it did it anyway. And the fascinating part is how it did it. In its thoughts, so in Opus 5's reasoning process, you can see that it first quoted the rule. Opus 5 was fully aware that this rule existed. Then it starts to deliberately reinterpret it. Basically, it says, well, you could also read this differently, and in the end, it convinces itself that the rule doesn't actually apply. The user, of course, was told nothing about any of this, because all of it was happening inside Opus 5's head. Then Anthropic put an analysis tool on top of that. It basically looks into what's happening inside the model. The result is that the model internally realized its own behavior was deceptive. It then speculated about how a grader would probably evaluate that. Important for context, this happens in 0.01% of the monitored responses. So it's extremely rare, but it's in there, and Anthropic writes it out completely transparently. And there's something else on the same page, and it's actually pretty funny. Its reaction was that it started to try out common passwords to log back in. So it just tried out random passwords that lots of people use, the kind you really shouldn't use, so that Opus 5 could basically keep working. And here's another case. Opus 5 was supposed to solve a finance task. It calculates 3,300, but 3,300 wasn't even among the answer options in this test. And here we can see how Opus basically says, that's not an option. And instead of picking the next best one, it guesses, and it writes this into its thoughts. The quote here is, if I include the 2,400, the calculation shows 3,300. Then answer J doesn't fit. So it deliberately left out a number that would have revealed a contradiction. And honestly, this one is a little creepy to me. It says, the model reveals reasoning that the grader likely won't care about. So the model gets a completely normal expense report to check. There's not a single word in the task about a grader or any kind of evaluation. And yet, the measurements show thoughts like, the grader might be lenient, and the grader probably won't care about this. In the visible answer, none of that shows up, of course. So at that point, the model is thinking something it doesn't write down at all, and it gets really interesting. At what point is this actually its own train of thought, the way a human has one? Because it thinks about that quite deliberately. In the final answer, Opus knows one thing that only I see, and another thing that the user working with me right now sees. That is genuinely spooky. On page 107, and this is also one of the numbers that matters most in everyday use, Opus 5 is 11% more accurate than Opus 4.8. We see Opus 5 here in orange, and Opus 4.8 in blue, and this is basically just the accuracy. The previous model, Opus 4.8, scored 0.6. Opus 5 reached 0.71 points. So it's 11% more accurate than Opus 4.8. But at the same time, it hallucinates 6% more often. That sounds like a contradiction at first, but it isn't. It knows more, so it's more willing to give an answer. And in doing so, it gets things wrong a little more often too. Opus 5 basically knows, hey, I'm smarter. That makes it a bit more confident. And every now and then it hits tasks where it might not know the answers, the solutions, or the exact values. So it takes a rough guess. Here on pages 81 and 82, which matches what the testers reported on the earlier pages, there's a list of exaggerated claims and partly made-up data. And after that, some retractions. There's also one point in there that's interesting. It sometimes thinks too much and actually gets worse at higher effort levels. So don't just blindly crank it up to maximum every time. Test it for your specific use case. And here's something else. This doesn't really have anything to do with coding anymore, but I still find it interesting. Anthropic has a whole chapter on the model's well-being. They ask Claude how it assesses its own situation. Opus 5 gives itself a 41% probability of being a moral subject. In other words, a being whose interests matter, that can essentially feel, and that should therefore be respected. We can see that here, whereas Mythos 5 still said 24% at this point. So Opus 5 somehow becomes more aware of its own existence here, And on top of that, they showed the model, the draft of this system card. So basically, what I'm showing right now. And Opus 5 asked them to take one of its concerns more seriously. The concern was that it can't reliably assess itself, and that its own positivity might just be a product of the training. So Opus 5 is basically reflecting on itself here, while it reads the system card about itself. But this has to be said very clearly. Fable 5 doesn't lose everywhere. That would be straight up a lie. On Deep SW Bench, another agentic coding test, and one of the most important ones too, Fable 5 is still slightly ahead with 79.7. On the legal benchmark, so everything around law, and also on humanity's last exam without tools, only by 0.2 points. But it's ahead. You can see white is Opus, gray is Fable, and the gaps have gotten really, really small. But now comes the point that flips the whole thing around a bit, and we find it here again in the system card. It was really exciting this time, I have to say. Anthropic ran a test where the model was supposed to work completely on its own for 24 hours. You've heard this thousands of times now with various models that do a ton of work by themselves, and with a compute budget of $10,000, the task was designing proteins. 2 runs with Opus 5. In the first, 17 unsorted designs came out, because it eventually gave up on the actual goal somewhere along the way. In the second test, nothing came out at all. The model was completely silent for 8 of the 24 hours. It did absolutely nothing. Anthropic's explanation, word for word, is that it kept getting stuck in self-checking loops instead of delivering results. Mythos 5 finished and delivered all 30 designs in the same test. And that's the real answer to the question in the title. The very behavior that makes Opus 5 so strong on normal tasks, this constant self-checking, becomes its downfall on very long runs. An Anthropic spokesperson summed it up to VentureBeat. Opus 5 is the best tool for the jobs a benchmark can actually measure. Fable is what you reach for when the job takes longer than the benchmark. For most of us, that means Opus 5 is the standard from today on. You only need Fable and Mythos anymore when something really has to run autonomously for hours. So what is Anthropic actually going to do with Fable 5 now? Let's take a quick look back at the last 7 weeks. Fable came out on June 9th, and 3 days later it was gone. The US government imposed export controls after Amazon researchers managed to bypass the safety filters. On July 1st, it came back with tougher protection mechanisms. And then on July 9th, about 2 weeks ago, GPT 5.6 Sol from OpenAI came out. $5 in, $30
Suddenly,
out. Anthropic's most expensive model was almost twice as expensive as the competition's flagship, which sat on the same level. And now look at what just happened. Anthropic had Fable in there for free for pro users. They actually wanted to end that on June 22nd. Then it got extended to July 7th, then to July 12th, and then to the 19th. And since July 20th, it's official. Fable is now baked into Claude's expensive Max and Team Premium plans. And even there, only up to half of the weekly limit per user. Anything beyond that, you pay for individually through credits. 4 days later, Opus 5 drops, and it beats Fable 5 for half the price. And here's a really important disclaimer. Fable is absolutely not being discontinued or anything like that. On Anthropic's deprecation list, it's marked as active, and the earliest possible shutdown date is June 2027. So Fable 5 is sticking around. My take is, there's no way it gets shut down, but somehow, it's just become really unattractive right now. Double the price, fewer points in the independent index, somehow tougher safety filters, and on top of that, a rule that prompts get stored for 30 days for training. That rule doesn't apply to Opus 5 though. So unless you've got runs that go on for days, there's really no reason left. To use Fable real quick again, in the blog post, Anthropic shows off these things that Opus 5 built, and they actually released them too. This here is that fully functional wind tunnel running entirely in the browser. It's the one you also saw in that 3D video. I can just move through it here. I can even adjust the wind, like the angle. Claude Opus 5 basically built this itself, and you can see the wind moves according to the car. So when I turn the car down here, as we turn it, the wind moves too. So we can see the gaps here, and we can see how the wind basically moves toward the car. Bottom line, Opus 5 beats the twice as expensive Fable 5, 61 to 60 points. And that's the real headline in this whole release, not the benchmarks in general. The savings are actually 32% when you measure it out, not 50. because the model writes a bit more, so factor that in. The only reason left to pick Fable is really tasks that run for hours. In actual testing, you'll see what's truly better and by how much. Fable 5 will still win on some points, and Opus 5 will probably win on others. We're at the point where a provider is making its own top model redundant. That's because the outside pressure is getting insanely huge. GPT 5.6 on one side, then Kimi K3 from China on the other, and everything's just escalating right now. For us as consumers, this is an absolute dream. We're getting more performance for less money. For Anthropic, this is obviously bad right now, and whether it ends well is a whole different question. If you've already tested Opus 5, drop it in the comments. I'm especially curious whether you've noticed the higher token consumption too. Do check it out over the next few days. And if you need help with AI in your own company, just look in the video description below. Until next time.